Hi, I'm Catherine Porter and I'm an independent energy consultant. In this video, I'm going to talk about the contracts for difference. These are the latest support scheme that the government has put in place to incentivise large-scale renewables in Britain. They replaced the previous scheme that was called a renewables obligation, and this is now the main scheme to which, or the only scheme which is available to new projects for wind, solar and various other renewable technologies. And so the way this works is essentially the government guarantees the income that the generator will receive for the duration of the contract. Now, some people argue that these are not actual subsidies, but I disagree with that. The reason they say this is that the way the contract is structured, sometimes the generator may pay money back to consumers. But overwhelmingly, it's been the other way around. And that being the case, and is likely to continue to be the case, then I think this is more correctly characterised as being a subsidy. It's a transfer of value from consumers to generators. And that transfer of value covers the cost of building the wind or solar and also the profits that the generator wishes to receive, essentially the return on the capital invested by them. Now, so how it works is that we have these auctions that take place. We call them allocation rounds. And the government has in mind a certain procurement target within that round, and there's an auction. And different generators, different project developers, because these are not built yet, these projects don't exist yet. So different project developers will bid for contracts in these auctions. And the metric around which they're bidding is the strike price. So the strike price is essentially the guaranteed income level that the generators will receive. And the government will organise this so that it doesn't matter what the generator gets when they sell their electricity, and they'll sell it in the market in the normal way. So they'll either enter a power purchase agreement where they sell all of their output to a single buyer, or they might break it up and sell bits and pieces in the wholesale market to different people over different time periods. But these contracts will typically have a reference price in them, and essentially that would need to match the reference price within the contracts for difference. And essentially what the government says is if the contracts for difference if the selling price that they get in the market is lower than the contract for difference strike price, then they will receive a top up from consumers. And if it's above that level, then the generators will pay back. And so I've got a chart that illustrates that here. So effectively, you can see that this is just kind of a hypothetical chart. If the red line is the strike price that's agreed in the contract, and this will apply for the entire 15-year duration of the contract, and it's indexed to inflation. And then the green line is the reference electricity price, the day ahead price. If the price at which the generator sells its electricity is lower than the strike price, then consumers will pay that extra money to the generators, and that's sort of this area here. So everywhere where it's below the red line, these represent periods where consumers are paying money to the generators. And then when it's above the line, the other way around, the generator will pay back. So the generator will always essentially make the strike price. That will be their income. They can't make more, nor can they make less. So coming back to this comment I made about whether this is a subsidy or not, this chart shows all of the payments, so the total payments made under all of the different contracts that have been signed. So far we've had 6 allocation rounds. The 7th will be taking place in the next few months. And you can see from this chart that although there have been some periods in which the generators repaid money to consumers, those periods are a minority. And in fact, this coincided with the gas crisis. So essentially what this is telling us is that it requires crisis levels of gas pricing before the CfD sees any money being paid back to consumers. And if you add up the totals here, you see that the total received by generators so far since the CfDs began back in 2016 has been almost £11.5 billion, and the amount repaid to consumers is about £750 million. So essentially only 6% of the overall cash flows have been from generators to consumers. The overwhelming majority have gone in the other direction. So I think it's pretty fair to call this a subsidy. Now, the generators will always receive this money as long as they are capable of generating from an availability perspective, i.e. Their plant is in full working order, and it's capable of generating because there's wind or sun. If it's not windy or sunny, then they don't get paid. So a solar farm, for example, does not expect to receive any income at night time. And a wind farm won't receive any income either if it's not windy or if wind speeds have gone so high that the turbines have been feathered for safety reasons. So in both of those scenarios, they receive zero income. Now, what we're seeing increasingly, particularly in the summer, is we experience periods of negative pricing. Now, this is generally not for the entire day. It'll just be for a few hours here and there. But, over time, that's actually been increasing. Now, in the very first auction round, AR1, back in 2015, there was really no rule around negative prices. All there was a cap that basically said the generator would not receive anything more than the value of the strike price. So if, for example, the strike price was £100 per megawatt hour and the market price went to -10, the normal formula would suggest that the generator would receive £110. But no, they were capped at £100. They couldn't receive more than the nominal value of the strike. However, there's a problem with this because if generators are going to still receive money for generating, even if the market has a huge surplus, and that's what negative prices imply, you get negative prices when there's a big surplus of generation, then they're incentivized to make that surplus worse, which is not in the best interest of the market or in the best interest of consumers. So in the next auction round, a rule was introduced called a 6-hour rule, which basically said that the contract payments would stop if the day ahead hourly prices were negative for 6 consecutive hours or more. So essentially a decent period of negative pricing would see a full cessation of the CfD payments for the duration of that negative pricing. And that was also maintained in the following round, which was AR3. Then in 2022 we had AR4, allocation round 4, and the 6-hour rule was abolished. And a new rule was brought in that was really designed to further disincentivize generators from producing more electricity during periods of oversupply. And they said, well, you're basically not going to get anything. If prices are negative, then you get nothing. And so we expect you to just turn yourselves off, because negative prices basically mean you're paying somebody to take away your generation. And if generators were paying someone to take away their generation under their power purchase agreement, but then they were getting fully compensated for that under their contract for difference, then that would be a perverse incentive to make the oversupply in the market worse. And so this rule has been maintained, and it will continue into AR7, which is taking place this year. Now, this hasn't been entirely popular with generators because as more renewable capacity is built, these periods of negative pricing are increasing, and particularly as we get more solar, you see this in the summer where solar is very much depressing demand because most of it is connected to the lower voltage grid, so that looks like negative generation or reduced demand on the transmission system. And so you get these periods of low demand, and it's lower demand anyway because it's the summertime, so fundamentally people are using less electricity as well, so you have a genuine reduction of demand plus the impact of distribution connected solar, and so you're getting more of these instances of negative pricing, and so more periods when generators don't receive any income. And of course that is going to affect their overall economics if these negative periods start to become more material. And so this is one of the things that generators are wishing to see change in future rounds, that they want some relaxation of these provisions. But this is a source of tension because clearly you don't want to encourage the increase of an oversupply situation. And if you pay generators, notwithstanding the negative prices, you encourage them to generate into an oversupplied market. And that's just really not economically efficient, and it's going to be detrimental to consumers. Now we're going to take a look here at the previous strike prices that we've had in the previous rounds. Now, historically, these were all expressed in 2012 money, but the government has now said that from now onwards, we're going to be expressing everything in 2024 money. So I've done that here. I used the Bank of England inflation calculator to do this. And I've just chosen the three most common technologies, the ones that represent the largest volumes. So we have offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar. And so what we observe here was that in the very first auction round, prices were still very high, that they fell quite significantly. They almost halved really for offshore wind between AR1 and AR2. Then there was another significant drop in AR3 and a smaller drop in AR4. And then things started to go horribly wrong. That little not applicable there under the offshore wind column for AR5, that was not, as was the case in previous rounds where there was a choice not to offer contracts for particular technologies. There were no bids for offshore wind. The government had intended to issue contracts to new offshore wind projects, but nobody was interested. And part of the reason for this was actually the low prices in AR4. Developers realised that they really weren't going to make any money at those levels. And so of the main projects that secured contracts in AR4, one of the big ones, Norfolk Boreas, they cancelled their contracts altogether. And all of the other ones, they rebid capacity into subsequent auctions. Now, under the capacity market rules, a generator can take a quarter of the volume of the contract and effectively move it from one allocation round to another. And so what all of the remaining offshore wind projects in AR4 did was they took their maximum 25% and they rebid it into AR6. And you can see how much more money they were able to earn by doing that, because AR6 priced much higher. Now, the other thing that the developers did in AR4 was they lobbied intensively to receive additional economics through tax breaks. They didn't get it, and that's largely, I would say, a main driver of the failure of AR5. And so the other thing to notice is that, so AR6 took place last year. Now, during 2024, we obviously didn't know what the average wholesale day-ahead power price would be for the whole year because the auction took place before the end of the year. But now looking back, we can see that that price was £72 per megawatt hour. And so what do we learn from this? We can see that solar and onshore wind priced just slightly below that level, and offshore wind priced 13% higher. And of course, this is just the first order cost of renewables. This is the subsidy. In terms of the cost to consumers of having these renewables, you have to add on top of this the cost of backup, the cost of connections, which is higher for renewables because of their low energy density. You have to add the cost of curtailment. Often renewables have to turn off because the grid can't cope with that output. And then you have to add the cost of real-time balancing, adjusting for the fact that gusts of wind and clouds and so on impact the moment-to-moment output. And it's far more expensive to balance the grid in those conditions than when you have conventional generation. And those curtailment costs arise directly because of the contracts for difference. I mentioned earlier that if the generator is available to generate, as in the machine isn't broken and there's wind or sun present, then they will get paid. Now, sometimes, and in some cases often, the electricity from that, and this is more common with wind farms, can't be used because of bottlenecks in the high voltage transmission system. And so when that happens, we have what we call curtailment. So the wind farm is told not to generate, but they get paid anyway as if they did generate. And we're getting quite ridiculous situations now where wind farms are built in the knowledge that most of their generation can't be used. A good example I've mentioned before is Seagreen, opened in 2023, October 23, and in 2024, 2/3 of its potential output was curtailed. So they generated half as much as they had curtailed in volumetric terms. So this is all adding to the costs that consumers bear when it comes to renewables. And I think, is already undermining this narrative of renewables being cheap, and certainly undermining the narrative that renewables are cheaper than generating electricity using gas. This is very clearly not 9 times cheaper, as has been claimed. Now, a comment on the bottom of this slide is that we're expecting AR7 to be higher again. So let me explore some of the drivers of that view. Now, here we can see a chart that shows the losses being made by the turbine manufacturers, the OEMs. So this, I haven't updated this chart. The losses did continue for a couple of years after 2022, obviously not for all of the OEMs, but certainly for some of them. Now, people tended to attribute these losses to COVID and to the Ukraine war, but in fact we can see that those losses started happening in 2018 and they grew from there. So this was made worse by COVID and the Ukraine war, but it had its origins earlier and was more based really on the fundamentals of the market. Now, clearly, this is not a sustainable position. You can't be losing billions of euros worth of money year in and year out. And so the turbine manufacturers started to do something about it. So what did they do about it? They started putting up their prices. And we can see from this chart the average turbine selling price of Vestas from 2018, the beginning of 2018 to the end of 2020. Their prices were pretty stable, just hovering around that 750,000 euros per megawatt level. And then they started to increase. And they've increased 65% since then. And, this increase is expected to continue. Now, what's driving this increase? We've had raw materials costs going up. We've had financing costs going up. We've had the turbine manufacturers tightening up their warranty provisions. They lost a lot of money under warranty claims, and so they've really reduced the scope for the wind farm developers to come and make claims under the warranty. So that obviously increases risk for the wind farm developers. And then finally, they've put up their prices just so they can restore their profits and repair their balance sheets. Now, fundamentally, they're not going to be willing to go back to making losses. And so we are not likely to see prices returning to that 750,000 euro mark, even if raw material costs fall. They've still got a ways to go to repair their balance sheets, and they're not going to want to get in that situation again. So this higher prices are likely here to stay. So what does this mean? My theory, and this is shared by many people in the market, that higher prices will be here to stay. And last week, the government published on the first day of the parliamentary recess, so without the usual scrutiny that you'd have when Parliament is in session, the administrative strike prices for the coming auction. Now, what these are effectively the maximum prices that the auction could clear at, the maximum level that generators could expect to secure in AR7. Now, there's been a fairly fundamental change between AR6 and AR7, and that's that instead of the contracts being 15 years in length, they're now going to be 20 years in length. So if we look at the AR6 prices, these are the same we had on the previous slide, and this in 2024 money. And so these are the administrative strike prices, not the cleared strike prices. And then we see what the administrative strike prices for AR7 are. Then you can see with the exception of solar, they are all higher. Now, if you were going to compare on a like-for-like basis in terms of the contract length, then that would be higher again, and then you compare it with the average wholesale price. You can see that actually your solar is worth 16% more than the wholesale price, primarily because of the impact of the contract extension. So there are various different estimates in the market of what that extension is worth. Some people think 10%, some people think 15%. I use 12% here, which is commonly cited. We can see that onshore wind becomes 42% more expensive versus the 2024 wholesale power price, and offshore wind would be 74% more expensive. So if the auction cleared at the maximum level, given that this is now a 20-year contract rather than a 16-year contract, it's significantly more expensive than it has been in the past, and certainly in the recent past. Here's another way of looking at this. So in this chart, we have the levelized cost of offshore wind. So I'm not a fan of levelized cost as a measure, but it's used by the government and by the Climate Change Committee. It basically excludes most of the actual costs that consumers bear when it comes to wind. But nevertheless, you can see that the expectation that the government has and the Climate Change Committee has is that these costs will, dramatically fell to 2020 and then would continue falling on a slower rate, but nevertheless, that is still a downward curve from 2025 to 2050. That's, falling in price by some significant amount, in fact. Now, I've also put in here the wholesale electricity prices, and so you can see the spike there we got in 2022 because of the Ukraine crisis, and how that's really fallen right back down. And then the red line is the CfD strike prices, the actual cleared CfD strike prices. And I've made an estimate for AR7. And effectively what I did was I took the AR6 administrative strike price and the AR7 administrative strike price, and I calculated the percentage increase. Then I inflated the AR7 by the further 12% because of the contract length, and that's how I arrived at the estimate here, which is just above £100 per megawatt hour. So this is really to do a like-for-like comparison. The headline number in the auction won't be £100 per megawatt hour. That would be something like 85 on this basis. But then if you make this adjustment for the increased duration of the contract, then that would be where you'd end up. And in fact, to really estimate whether AR7 is more expensive than AR6, you'd need to take this into account. Okay, this is the end of the slide. Okay, so what does this actually mean in practice? We have, so the auction will take place in the next few months. And this is actually going to be something of a problem for Ed Miliband, because he has announced this huge plan to have clean power in 2030. And the only way that he can achieve this is by massively increasing the amounts of wind and solar. So effectively, there's no price tension in this auction. He's going to have to give contracts pretty much to everybody that wants one. And when you're in a seller's market, effectively, you're a price taker. And that would drive the prices higher, because even if the developers didn't need the money, although I think they do, but even if they didn't, they're obviously going to want to get as much as they can. And if the auction has to clear with every project accepted, or materially every project accepted, there's no price tension, and it's going to price pretty much at or close to the cap. Now that will be absolutely disastrous for Ed Miliband, because he has been promising that we will see £300 reductions in our bills by 2030. I'm told that the Prime Minister has recently been asking when we can expect this £300. It was a huge manifesto promise that the government made. It was all over their election campaign. They were going to save us £300 on our electricity bills, and this was going to be what you got for voting Labour. So it's going to be very difficult for Miliband to sign contracts which will make delivery of that £300 next to impossible. The only way that he could then both have those high price contracts and still potentially deliver on the £300 would be if all of those subsidies were then recovered through taxation instead of through bills. And that would obviously be a pretty fake way of achieving it. Yes, you could reduce your energy costs, but really you're just paying for it out of tax instead. I don't know that consumers and voters are going to be very persuaded by that as a strategy. And the other problem is that if you start signing contracts that are materially higher than the existing electricity price that you get from gas, then you can no longer claim that renewables are cheap. And already from last year's auction, that narrative was strongly undermined. If you now come along and you sign a contract that's equivalent to £100 a megawatt hour, that's 40% higher than the price of electricity generated from gas, there is absolutely no way you can continue to claim with a straight face that renewables are cheap. And so I think Miliband is in some real trouble here. It's going to be politically just about impossible to sign a contract with a headline strike price much above £80 to £85. And I think he's going to need to sign above that level in order to get the volumes that he wants. And so I see a very real chance actually that the Prime Minister steps in here, tells him you cannot sign deals at this level. This will be a betrayal of our promise to lower bills, and that Miliband ultimately then would lose his job. And that would obviously be a very positive thing, because hopefully we could get a new energy secretary who would reset energy policy based on evidence and not ideology. So I hope this has explained a little bit about how the CfD works. I know I'd had some comments in earlier videos to explain this, so I hope that's clear. Please raise any questions in the comments to this video if anything wasn't clear, and I'll try and answer them. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.